I still remember the exact sound my chair made when I pushed it back from that dinner table. It was a scrape. Loud. Deliberate. The kind of sound that cuts through conversation and makes every single person in the room go quiet. My mother-in-law, Linda, froze mid-sentence with her serving spoon hovering over a dish of roasted potatoes. My husband, Brandon, finally looked up from his plate, the plate that had been full since the moment he sat down, while my two kids, 7-year-old Maya and 5-year-old Caleb, sat there with empty plates in front of them. Not half empty, not picked over, empty. Like they weren't even guests at that table, like they weren't even people. "Your kids can eat tomorrow," Linda had said, not 5 minutes earlier, in the same casual tone you'd use to tell someone the weather forecast. "Tonight we have a lot of adults and not enough of everything. They'll be fine." I want you to hold that sentence for a second. Really sit with it. Because when I replay it in my head, and I have replayed it roughly 10,000 times since that Sunday in October, I still can't fully process how a person forms those words in their mouth and lets them out into the air. Your kids can eat tomorrow. My children, 7 and 5 years old, sitting at her table, in her home, hungry, watching every adult around them get served while they got nothing. And the worst part, the part that almost broke me more than anything Linda did that night, was that Brandon just sat there. He picked up his fork, he cut a piece of roasted chicken, and he ate it. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because to understand why that moment destroyed something fundamental in me, you have to understand what I thought my life was before it. You have to understand the woman I was when I walked into that house, trusting, hopeful, maybe a little naive, and how completely I had convinced myself that everything was fine. Let me take you back about 4 years. I met Brandon Mitchell at a company picnic, of all places, the kind of forced fun corporate event where everyone stands around in the August heat pretending they chose to be there. He was tall, easygoing, with this slow smile that made you feel like he actually saw you when he looked at you. We worked for different departments at the same insurance company in Columbus, Ohio. I was in claims processing, he was in IT. Our paths had never crossed in the building, but they crossed hard that afternoon over a shared hatred of three-legged races and warm potato salad. "Tell me you're not about to eat that," he said, nodding at the paper plate I was holding. "I was going to be polite about it," I said. "There's a Chipotle 2 blocks away," he said. "I'm just saying." We left the picnic early and talked for 3 hours over burritos and iced tea. I was 31 years old. I had been through one serious relationship that ended quietly and without drama, and I had more or less accepted that I was the kind of person who was better at her career than at romance. I was a project manager by nature, even in my personal life. I made lists, I planned things, I was punctual to a fault. My friends called me the most organized disaster they'd ever met, which was their affectionate way of saying I was wound a little tight. Brandon was the opposite. He was relaxed in a way that felt almost foreign to me. He didn't check his phone every 5 minutes. He laughed easily. He remembered small things, what I said I liked, what I said I didn't, and brought them up weeks later in ways that felt genuine rather than calculated. By our 4th date, I was already in trouble. We dated for 2 years. He proposed on a Tuesday night in our apartment kitchen, which sounds unromantic, but was actually perfect. He got down on one knee in the middle of making dinner, with sauce on his shirt and flour on his hands, and said, "I can't think of anyone I'd rather make a mess with for the rest of my life." I said yes before he even got the ring box fully open. We got married in May, small ceremony, 70 people, backyard of my parents' place in Westerville. My mom cried. His mom, Linda, smiled, the tight, controlled kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. I noticed it, but I told myself I was imagining things. First meeting jitters, normal family friction, nothing to worry about. We bought a house the following spring, a 3-bedroom colonial in Gahanna, nothing fancy, but ours, with a yard big enough for a dog and a porch where I could drink my coffee in the mornings. We had Maya 14 months after the wedding, Caleb 2 years after that. I went back to work part-time when Maya was 8 months old and full-time after Caleb turned 2. We had a system. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Grocery runs on Saturday mornings, takeout on Thursdays, because by Thursday we were both too tired to cook. Homework at the kitchen table, bedtime at 8:30, and then Brandon and I would sit on that porch for an hour before bed and just talk. Those porch hours were my favorite part of my week. I think about them a lot now. We weren't rich. Brandon made around $78,000 a year. I made $64,000. Between the mortgage, daycare, car payments, and trying to actually save something for the kids' college funds, we were comfortable but careful. We took one real vacation a year, usually a week somewhere drivable, a rental house on a lake in Michigan or a cabin in the Smoky Mountains. We talked about finances openly. We had a joint account. We had a shared Google Calendar that was color-coded by person. I know how that sounds. I'm telling you, it worked for us. And Linda. Linda lived 40 minutes away in a suburb called Dublin, a nice neighborhood. Big houses, well-maintained lawns, the kind of place where the HOA newsletter comes out twice a month and is taken very seriously. She was a retired dental hygienist, 63 years old, widowed 6 years earlier when Brandon's dad, Gary, passed from a heart attack. She had one other child, Brandon's older sister, Tanya, who lived in Phoenix and visited maybe twice a year. From the very beginning, Linda and I had what I would describe as a careful relationship. Not warm, not hostile, careful. She was polite at family dinners. She remembered the kids' birthdays. She brought things over sometimes, casseroles, little gifts for Maya and Caleb, a plant for our kitchen once that I killed within 3 weeks despite my best efforts. On the surface, everything looked fine. But there were moments, small ones, the kind you almost dismiss as nothing. The time she told me, in front of Brandon, that she had hoped he'd end up with someone a little more settled. And when I asked what she meant, she said, "Oh, you know, someone who didn't have so much going on." I was 3 months postpartum with Maya and had just gone back to work. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just said, and changed the subject. The time she watched me discipline Maya at her house. Maya had thrown a minor tantrum over a toy, and Linda said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Some children just need a firmer hand from the start." I let it go. I always let it go. The comments about my cooking, delivered as suggestions. The way she would talk to Brandon about family decisions before he had a chance to talk to me. The way she sometimes looked at the kids, not warmly the way a grandmother should, but assessing, like she was grading them against some internal rubric I didn't have access to. I told myself it was generational. I told myself it was grief. She had lost her husband, she was lonely, she was protective of her son. I told myself that difficult mother-in-laws were practically a rite of passage in America, and I was not going to be the kind of woman who made her husband choose. I told myself a lot of things. It was Brandon's birthday weekend, the last Saturday of October, when we drove over to Linda's for what she called a family celebration dinner. She had invited a few of her friends, Brandon's Aunt Patricia, and us. I packed an overnight bag for the kids because Linda had suggested we stay the night, save the drive. I packed snacks for Maya and Caleb the way I always did when we went anywhere, because 5-year-olds and 7-year-olds don't always eat what's served, and I liked to be prepared. I remember pulling into Linda's driveway and thinking that everything looked exactly the way it always did. Neat hedges, warm light in the windows, the smell of something roasting when we came through the front door. I had no idea that by the time I left that house, something between Brandon and me would be permanently, irreversibly changed. I had no idea I was walking in carrying an overnight bag and a container of goldfish crackers, completely unprepared for the worst dinner of my life. The house smelled like rosemary and garlic when we walked through Linda's front door, and for one brief, stupid moment, I felt something close to optimism. Maya immediately grabbed my hand when she saw the unfamiliar faces in the living room. She was like that, my serious, watchful kid who needed a minute to assess a room before she'd let herself relax in it. Caleb, on the other hand, went straight for the dog. Linda's neighbor Patricia had brought her golden retriever, and Caleb had zero fear and zero social hesitation, which was both a gift and a constant source of low-level parental anxiety for me. "There they are," Linda said, coming out of the kitchen in a floral apron, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She smiled at Brandon first, the way she always did, that full, genuine, lit-up smile she reserved exclusively for him. And then she turned it down a few degrees when she looked at me. "Ashley, so glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, and I meant it. I was genuinely trying. I had been trying for 4 years. The living room was arranged with extra chairs pulled in from the dining room, and I could see through the archway that the table was set formally. Linda's good china, cloth napkins, the crystal glasses she kept in the hutch. Brandon's Aunt Patricia was already seated on the couch with a glass of white wine, and 2 of Linda's friends from her neighborhood, women I'd met maybe twice before, Donna and Sybil, were standing near the fireplace talking about something involving their HOA and a fence dispute that had apparently been going on for the better part of a year. I found seats for Maya and Caleb near the edge of the room, got them settled with the coloring books I'd packed, and went to the kitchen to see if Linda needed help. "Oh, I have it handled," she said without looking up from the stove. "You should go enjoy yourself." "I really don't mind," I said. "I can set out the bread or—" "Ashley." She turned and looked at me with that patient, measured expression she used when she thought I was being dense. "I said I have it handled." I went back to the living room. Brandon was already deep in conversation with Patricia, catching up on family news, and I sat with the kids for a while and helped Caleb stay inside the lines on a picture of a fire truck. The evening moved the way those evenings do, slowly, pleasantly, with the comfortable hum of adult conversation and the smell of food getting closer to done. Dinner was called at 7. Linda had set up the table beautifully. The roasted chicken I'd smelled from the door, a dish of roasted potatoes, green beans with almonds, some kind of cranberry relish in a glass bowl, dinner rolls. There were 8 place settings: me, Brandon, Maya, Caleb, Linda, Patricia, Donna, and Sybil. We all found our seats. Maya and Caleb sat next to each other across from me, their little cloth napkins in their laps, because Maya had watched me unfold mine and immediately did the same, and Caleb had followed her lead. I remember thinking, in that warm, distracted way you think things when you're still believing everything is fine, that I had pretty great kids. Linda sat at the head of the table. She picked up the serving spoon for the potatoes and began going around the table, serving each plate. She served Patricia first, then Donna, then Sybil, then Brandon, then herself. Then she set the spoon down. I waited. Maybe she was going for the chicken next, going around in some order I hadn't tracked. Maya's plate was still empty. Caleb was looking at the bread basket with the focused attention of a child who has been patient for a long time and is running low on reserves. Linda reached for the bread basket and passed it to Patricia. "Linda," I said carefully, "you didn't get the kids." She looked at me. There was a pause, not a confused pause, not a forgot what I was doing pause, a considered one. "The children can wait," she said. "We don't have quite enough of everything for everyone, and the adults should eat first. They can have something after." The table went very quiet. Not silent. Donna had started to say something about the cranberry relish, and the words just sort of trailed off when the air changed. Patricia looked down at her plate. Sybil picked up her wine glass. I looked at Brandon. He was looking at his mother. And I watched very carefully as something passed across his face. Not outrage, not even surprise. Something that looked, if I'm being completely honest, like the faint muscle memory of a person who has heard this kind of thing before and has learned to wait for it to pass. "They're kids," I said. "They're 7 and 5. They need to eat." "They had snacks on the way over, I'm sure," Linda said pleasantly. "You always bring snacks. They'll be perfectly fine until we're finished." She said it the way you'd say it to a slightly hysterical stranger, gently, dismissively, with the confidence of a woman who had decided, before I even opened my mouth, that this was not a real problem. "Brandon," I said. He finally looked at me. And what I saw on his face in that moment was something I have turned over and over in my mind in the months since. Because it wasn't cruelty. It wasn't agreement with his mother. It was something almost worse. It was the look of a man who was hoping, very hard, that if he stayed still enough, the moment would pass without him having to do anything about it. "Mom," he said quietly, "maybe we can just—" "The food is hot and it should be eaten," Linda said, in a tone that closed the subject like a door being shut. "The children are not starving. They can eat when the adults are finished. That is how dinner parties work." That is how dinner parties work. I picked up my fork. I set it back down. I looked at Maya, who was looking at me with those careful eyes of hers, reading my face the way she always did when she was trying to figure out whether to be worried. Caleb had stopped looking at the bread basket. He was looking at his empty plate. I reached across the table and took 2 dinner rolls from the basket and put one on each of their plates. Linda watched me do it. She didn't say anything, but her jaw tightened in a way I had learned to recognize over 4 years, and she turned pointedly back to her own plate and began to eat. Dinner continued. The adults ate. The conversation resumed. The HOA fence dispute, something about Patricia's daughter's new job in Atlanta, Brandon's birthday, and what he was hoping to do in the coming year. Linda laughed at something Donna said. Brandon refilled Patricia's wine. I sat there with a full plate of food in front of me that I could not make myself eat, watching my kids work through their dinner rolls with the serious dedication of children who are hungry and have been given exactly one thing. At some point, I think we were about halfway through the main course, Caleb said in his clear, carrying 5-year-old voice, "Mommy, can I have some chicken?" Every adult at that table heard him. No one could have not heard him. Brandon reached for the serving dish. "The chicken is for the adults tonight, sweetheart," Linda said to Caleb, with a smile so warm it made my stomach turn. "You can have some later." Brandon put his hand back in his lap. That was when I pushed back my chair. I want to tell you that I stood up with some kind of fully formed plan, that I knew exactly what I was going to say, that I had calculated the move and made it deliberately. But the truth is, my body made the decision before my brain finished processing what was happening. I stood up, and the chair scraped loud against Linda's hardwood floor, and every person at that table looked at me. "Caleb," I said, keeping my voice steady through what felt like an enormous amount of effort, "Maya, come with me." "Ashley," Brandon started, "I'm getting my kids some food," I said, "from the kitchen, because they're hungry, because they're children and they're hungry." Linda set down her fork. "There is no need for a scene." "I'm not making a scene," I said. "I'm feeding my children." Those are 2 very different things. I took Maya's hand, and Caleb followed, and I walked into Linda's kitchen, and I opened her refrigerator, and I found leftover rotisserie chicken from what looked like earlier in the week, and I made my kids plates. Real plates, with actual food on them. My hands were shaking the entire time, not from fear exactly, but from something that felt like the physical sensation of a dam starting to crack. We came back to the table. I set the plates down in front of them. Caleb picked up his fork immediately with the joyful efficiency of a child who has been waiting very patiently and is finally allowed to stop. The table was silent, and then Linda said, quietly, with a kind of precision that told me she had been holding it, "That was rude, Ashley. That food wasn't meant to be touched." "Then you should have fed my children," I said. We looked at each other across that table, and I understood, maybe for the first time with real clarity, that this was not a misunderstanding. This was not generational difference or grief or a bad night. This was something Linda had decided about me and about my kids a long time ago. And I understood something else, something colder and more frightening. Brandon had known. Not all of it, maybe, but enough. He had known enough to brace himself when we walked in, and he had sat there anyway and eaten his chicken and said nothing. After dinner, Linda asked Brandon to help her in the kitchen. They were in there for 20 minutes. I sat in the living room with the kids, listening to the low murmur of their voices through the wall, and I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the rhythm of it. Linda talking. Brandon mostly quiet with short responses, the particular cadence of a son being managed by his mother and allowing it. When he came back out, he sat next to me and lowered his voice. "She feels bad," he said. I looked at him. "She wants to apologize," he said. She said she didn't realize how it would come across. "Brandon," I said, "she told our son the chicken was for adults while he was sitting right there." "I know," he said, "I know. She gets a certain way when she has guests. She has this idea of how things should go. She didn't feed our children." He was quiet for a second. Then, "I know it looked bad, but she's going to apologize, and I think if we just let her do that, we can move past it and the rest of the weekend can still be—" "The rest of the weekend," I repeated. "We were going to stay over," he said. "The kids were excited about—" "Brandon," I stopped him. "Do you understand what happened tonight? Not how it looked, what actually happened." He looked at me with that same expression from the dinner table. The one that wasn't cruelty, wasn't agreement, was something much more specifically painful. The expression of a man who understood exactly what happened and was hoping the cost of addressing it would somehow be lower than the cost of letting it go. "Let her apologize," he said. "Please, for tonight, just let her apologize." And here is the part that I am least proud of, the part I've turned over more times than I can count, trying to figure out what I should have done differently. I said okay. I let Linda come into the living room and crouch down in front of Caleb and tell him she was sorry that dinner had been confusing. And I watched my son tell her it was okay, because he is 5 and he doesn't yet know that some apologies aren't really apologies. And I sat there, and I accepted the version of the evening that Brandon needed me to accept, because I was tired, and because we were 40 minutes from home with overnight bags packed, and because some part of me still believed, God help me, I still believed, that this was a one-time thing, a bad night, an anomaly. We stayed the night. I lay in Linda's guest room staring at the ceiling while Brandon slept next to me, and I thought about the way he'd reached for the serving dish and then put his hand back in his lap, how quickly he'd done it, how automatic it had been, that withdrawal, like a reflex, like something practiced. And I started, in the dark and the quiet of that guest room, to think about all the other times I had watched him withdraw like that, smaller times, times I had filed away as nothing. There had been more of them than I wanted to count. I didn't sleep. By 3 a.m, I was fully, coldly awake, and the story I had been telling myself about my marriage was starting to look, in that unsparing dark, like something with a lot more holes in it than I had previously been willing to see. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. Out of habit, or maybe out of something more deliberate that I wasn't quite ready to name, I opened Brandon's texts. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. Or maybe I want to be clear that I'd never felt the need to before. But his phone had a notification lit up, and when I glanced at it, I saw a name I didn't recognize. The name was Melissa. The preview text, visible without unlocking the phone, read, "Still thinking about last Tuesday. When can I—" The rest was cut off. I set the phone back on the nightstand, very carefully, like it was something that might break if I moved too fast. Brandon was asleep beside me, breathing slow and even. I lay there in Linda's guest room, in the dark, with the smell of rosemary still faint in the air from dinner, and I felt the bottom of something drop out from under me entirely. I put my phone back on the nightstand the same way you'd put down a live grenade, slowly, with tremendous care, like the gentleness of the motion could somehow undo what had already happened. Brandon was still asleep. His breathing hadn't changed. The room was dark except for the thin strip of light under the guest room door, and the house was completely silent in the way that houses are silent at 3 a.m. Not peaceful, but hollow, like all the sound had been evacuated, and what was left was just pressure. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling, and I thought, Melissa. I didn't know a Melissa. In 4 years of marriage, through work parties and neighborhood cookouts and the various orbits of Brandon's professional and social life, I had never once heard that name. I searched my memory the way you search a drawer when you know what you're looking for isn't there, thoroughly, uselessly, with mounting dread. Nothing. The name meant nothing to me, which meant it was something he had kept entirely separate, which meant it had been deliberate. Still thinking about last Tuesday. Last Tuesday. I lay there and I thought about last Tuesday. Brandon had worked late. He'd texted me around 6 to say a deployment had gone sideways and he'd be home after 9. I'd made dinner for the kids, done baths, gotten them into bed, and waited up. He'd come home smelling like takeout and tiredness, kissed me on the cheek, said the deployment was a mess, asked if there was anything left to eat. I had reheated him a plate of pasta. He'd sat at our kitchen table and eaten it, and told me about the server issue in enough detail that I had believed, completely and without question, that that was what his evening had been. I had reheated him a plate of pasta while he was texting someone named Melissa that he was still thinking about her. The ceiling didn't have anything useful to say about this. I got up at 4:30 because lying there had started to feel like a form of self-harm. I moved quietly, the way you move in someone else's house, careful of the floorboards, careful not to wake Brandon, careful in the specific way I had been careful for 4 years, always calibrating how much space I took up, always managing the temperature of the room. I pulled on the cardigan I'd draped over the chair the night before, and I went downstairs to Linda's kitchen. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I turned on the small lamp above the stove, the one Linda kept on a dimmer, and I sat down at her kitchen table in the half-dark, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I was carrying. My kids were upstairs asleep in Linda's spare room, in the little twin beds she kept for grandchildren she treated like afterthoughts. My husband was upstairs asleep with his phone on the nightstand. The woman who had told my 5-year-old son that the chicken was for adults was asleep down the hall, having delivered what she considered an adequate apology, and closed the book on the evening with the efficiency of someone who has never once been required to truly account for herself. And I was sitting alone in her kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, feeling like the floor of my life had dissolved under me so gradually that I'd only just looked down and noticed I was falling. I want to be honest about what those hours felt like, because I think if you've ever been in that particular kind of darkness, the kind that isn't loud or dramatic, that is just quiet and cold and total, you'll recognize it. It wasn't crying. I wanted to cry, and I couldn't, which was almost worse, because at least crying has a shape to it. This was something more formless, a sense of complete disorientation, like every fixed point I'd been navigating by had turned out to be a projection, and the real landscape underneath was nothing like the map I'd been using. I thought about Brandon reaching for the serving dish and putting his hand back in his lap. I thought about him saying, "She wants to apologize," with the weary patience of a man running a script he knew by heart. I thought about the times I'd noticed something and told myself I was imagining it. The comments Linda made that I'd filed under generational difference. The way Brandon went quiet when his mother was in the room. Not sullen quiet, but compliant quiet, like a man returning to a shape he'd been pressed into long before I came along. I thought about Melissa. I was still sitting at that table when I heard footsteps on the stairs at 6:15. Not Brandon's, lighter, careful. I looked up, and it was Patricia. Brandon's aunt was in her late 60s, small and compact, with silver hair she wore short and close to her head. I had always liked Patricia, in the vague, untested way you like people you only see 3 or 4 times a year. She was warm without being intrusive, asked genuine questions about the kids, laughed easily. But we had never had what I would call a real conversation. She was Linda's family more than mine, and I had always kept that line clear in my mind. She stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw me. "Oh," she said, "I didn't think anyone would be up." "I couldn't sleep," I said. She looked at me for a moment, really looked, the way people do when they're deciding how much to acknowledge. Then she came into the kitchen and went to the cabinet where Linda kept the coffee and started filling the machine like she'd done it 100 times before. "I couldn't either," she said. "Haven't slept well at Linda's since Gary died. The house sounds different without him in it." She got the coffee going, and then she sat down across from me, and for a minute neither of us said anything. The coffee maker started its cycle, filling the kitchen with the smell of it, and the light through the window was just beginning to go from black to gray. "Last night was hard," Patricia said. Not a question. "Yes," I said. "She's done it before," Patricia said. "Not exactly that, but versions of it." I looked at her. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what happened," she said. "I've known Linda for 35 years. I know how she operates." She paused. I should have said something at the table. I didn't. I'm not proud of that. "Why didn't you?" I asked. And I wasn't asking it with anger. I was genuinely asking, because I needed to understand the ecosystem I had been living inside without fully seeing. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because Linda doesn't respond to being challenged in front of people. She digs in. It would have made it worse for you and worse for your kids, and I made a calculation in the moment that turned out to be the wrong one." She looked at me steadily. "I'm sorry, Ashley. What she did was wrong. Those are babies." Something cracked open in me when she said that. Not dramatically, not tears, not a flood, just a quiet, specific release, like a joint that had been locked for a long time, finally giving. Because it was the first time in 4 years that someone in Brandon's family had looked at something Linda did and called it what it was. Wrong. Not difficult, not just her way. Wrong. "Has she always been like this with Brandon?" I asked. Patricia wrapped both hands around the coffee mug she'd poured. "Brandon is her project," she said carefully. "He always has been. Gary was a good man, but he wasn't present, not really. So Linda poured everything into Brandon. And the thing about being someone's project is that it feels like love from the inside. You don't always know it's a cage until someone tries to leave it." "Does he know?" I asked. "He knows enough to brace himself," she said. "Whether he knows it's a problem—" She stopped. "You'd know that better than I would." I thought about his face at the dinner table, that specific expression, the practiced stillness of a man waiting for something to pass. "I found something on his phone last night," I said. I hadn't planned to say it. It came out of me the way things do at 4 in the morning in a half-dark kitchen when you've been alone with something for too many hours. Patricia didn't react with shock. She looked at me with something more measured, a kind of careful attention that felt, in that moment, like exactly what I needed. "A name," I said. "A text preview. Someone named Melissa." The coffee maker beeped. Patricia got up and refilled both our cups without saying anything. She set mine back in front of me and sat down. "I don't know what that is," I said. "Maybe nothing, maybe—" "You know it's not nothing," she said, gently but directly, "or you wouldn't be sitting here at 6 in the morning." I looked down at my coffee. "No," I said, "I don't think it's nothing." We sat there for another minute in the growing gray light. Then Patricia said, "Do you have someone you trust? Not in Brandon's circle, yours." "My friend Danielle," I said. "We've been friends since college." "Call her today," Patricia said, "before you do anything else. Before you talk to Brandon, before you try to work anything out in your head, call someone who is yours and tell them what you know. Because what comes next is going to require you to be very clear about what you're doing and why. And you can't be clear alone. Nobody can." I nodded. "And Ashley," she said, and her voice had a quality in it that made me look up. "Whatever happened last night, whatever is happening with Brandon, you did the right thing. Getting up from that table, going into that kitchen, feeding your children." She held my gaze. "Don't let anyone rewrite that. Don't let anyone, including Brandon, make you feel like that was the problem." I drove home that morning. I packed the overnight bags, woke the kids, told Brandon I had a headache and needed to get back. He looked at me with a complicated expression I didn't have the bandwidth to decode, and he didn't push back. Linda was in her kitchen when we left, and she said goodbye to the kids with that warm, performed grandmother smile, and she looked at me and said, "Drive safe, Ashley." And I said, "Thank you for having us," because I was still, even then, performing my part of the script. But something had shifted, something quiet and structural, the way a crack in a foundation shifts, not visible yet from the outside, but changed irrevocably in its integrity. I buckled Maya and Caleb into their car seats in Linda's driveway. Caleb had fallen back asleep before we hit the end of the street. Maya watched me from her seat with those careful eyes of hers and said, "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm working on it, baby," I said. I drove the 40 minutes home with both hands on the wheel and my mind already somewhere else, somewhere ahead of where I was, making a list. The kind of list I make when I have understood that a situation is a project, and a project requires a plan, and a plan requires information, and information requires action. I was going to call Danielle. I was going to look at our joint financial accounts, all of them. I was going to think very carefully about what I knew, what I suspected, and what I needed to find out before I said a single word to Brandon. And I was going to stop being careful about how much space I took up. I pulled into our driveway in Gahanna, the 3-bedroom colonial with the yard big enough for a dog, and the porch where we used to sit and talk in the evenings. I sat in the car for a moment after I cut the engine, looking at the house. It looked the same as it always had. Neat, solid, mine. I took out my phone and I scrolled to Danielle's name. She answered on the second ring, her voice still thick with early morning. "Ash, it's not even 8. I need to talk to you," I said. "Something happened. And I need you to help me figure out what to do next." There was a short pause. Then Danielle said, with the immediate, unconditional readiness of a person who has been your friend for 14 years, "I'm here. Tell me everything." And I did. Danielle listened to all of it without interrupting once, which is one of the things I have always loved most about her. She let me talk for 45 minutes straight, sitting in my car in my own driveway, while Brandon was inside getting the kids settled back in, still in their pajamas, still half asleep. And she didn't fill the silence with reassurances or redirect me toward hope. She just listened. And when I finally stopped, she said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." Danielle had been through her own divorce 3 years earlier. Not dramatic, not explosive, just the quiet unraveling of a marriage that had been wrong from the start, handled through mediation and a very competent attorney named Rachel Sorensen, who had an office in Worthington and a reputation for being methodical and unflappable. Danielle gave me Rachel's number before we hung up. "Don't call her today," she said. "Today you rest, you hug your kids, you don't say a word to Brandon, but you call her Monday morning, first thing." "I don't know for certain yet," I said. "About Melissa. I only saw a preview." "Ashley," Danielle said, gently and firmly, the way she'd been saying my name for 14 years when she needed me to hear something clearly. "You know." I knew. I spent that Sunday doing exactly what Danielle told me to do. I made the kids pancakes. I watched a movie with them on the couch. Caleb pressed against my left side and Maya against my right, and I held them both a little tighter than usual and tried not to let them see the thing behind my eyes. Brandon moved around the house at a careful distance, the way he'd been doing since I'd told him I had a headache. He made coffee. He asked if I needed anything. I said I was fine. He looked relieved, which told me everything about what he thought was happening. He thought the headache was about Linda, that I was processing the dinner, that by Monday morning I would be ready to fold it into the file of difficult Linda moments and move on. He had no idea I had stopped moving on. Monday morning, I called Rachel Sorensen at 8:52. She had an opening Thursday afternoon. I took it. In the 3 days between Sunday and Thursday, I did the most important thing Patricia had told me to do. I got clear. I pulled up every joint financial account we had, checking, savings, the investment account we'd opened 2 years earlier with the intention of eventually putting a down payment on something bigger. I took photographs of every statement with my phone. I looked at Brandon's credit card charges going back 6 months. We had a joint card, and I was listed as an authorized user, so I had full access, and I went through them line by line. There were restaurants I didn't recognize. On nights he'd said he was working late. A hotel charge in late September for a place in downtown Columbus, $187, on a Thursday when he had supposedly been at a conference in the office building he worked in every day. A charge at a jewelry store in August, $340, that had never produced anything I'd received. I photographed everything. I also, on Wednesday evening while Brandon was putting the kids to bed, picked up his phone from the kitchen counter. He'd left it there while he went upstairs, which was either careless or trusting or both. I went into his messages. I found Melissa Chen, full name, now that I could see the contact. There were 4 months of texts. I didn't read all of them. I read enough to understand what they were, and then I photographed the screen in 3 places that captured enough to be unambiguous. I put the phone back exactly where it had been. I went to Rachel's office Thursday afternoon and told her I had a 2:30 appointment. Her receptionist showed me into a conference room with good lighting and a box of tissues on the table. And I sat there with my folder of photographs and my notes, and I waited. Rachel Sorensen was 51 years old, with reading glasses on a chain and the particular composure of someone who has heard every variation of every story and has learned not to perform surprise. She shook my hand, sat across from me, and said, "Tell me what's going on." I told her. All of it. The dinner at Linda's, the text preview, the credit card statements, the hotel charge, the jewelry store, the photographs of Melissa's texts. I laid the folder on the table between us, and she went through it without comment, page by page, glasses on, expression neutral. When she finished, she took off her glasses and looked at me. "You've done the right things," she said. "The documentation is good. The financial records are especially important." She paused. "What is it you want, Ashley? Not what do you think you should want. What do you actually want?" "I want out," I said. "I want my kids protected. I want the house or the equity from it if we have to sell. I want him nowhere near our finances without transparency." I stopped. "And I want it done in a way that doesn't blow up my children's lives more than it has to." She nodded. "All of that is achievable," she said. "It won't be fast, it won't be without conflict, but it's achievable." We talked for an hour and a half. When I left, I had a retainer agreement in my purse and a plan. I told Brandon that Friday evening, after the kids were in bed. I asked him to sit down at the kitchen table, our kitchen table, the one he'd sat at and eaten reheated pasta while texting Melissa Chen. And I sat across from him and I put my hands flat on the table and I said, "I need to talk to you about some things I found." The color left his face before I even opened the folder. I showed him the hotel charge. I showed him the jewelry store charge. I showed him the photographs of the texts. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I had spent 4 days getting to a place inside myself that was past the hot, raw grief of it and into something colder and more functional, and I stayed in that place. He tried, for about 8 minutes, to find a version of the story that made it something other than what it was. The hotel was a work thing. The jewelry was for his mother's birthday. I'd just forgotten he mentioned it. The texts were... He ran out of road on the texts. There was nothing to do with the texts except stop. "How long?" I said. He looked at the table. 7 months. 7 months. Since March. Since the spring, when the kids and I had planted tomatoes in the backyard garden, and Brandon had stood on the porch with his coffee and watched us and smiled. I had thought in that moment that we were happy. "I'm sorry," he said. And I believed him. Not that it changed anything, but I believed he meant it. "I've already spoken to an attorney," I said. "I'm going to be filing for divorce. I wanted you to know directly from me before anything official arrives." He looked up. "Ashley, I'm not going to fight with you," I said. "I'm going to work through Rachel Sorensen's office, and I'd like this to be as straightforward as possible for the kids' sake. But I need you to understand that I am not changing my mind." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Does this have anything to do with what happened at my mom's?" And I looked at him, really looked at him, at this man I had loved genuinely and completely for 4 years, at the slow smile and the easy laugh, and the person who had proposed to me with sauce on his shirt and flour on his hands. And I said, "Brandon, What happened at your mom's dinner table told me everything I needed to know about what you were willing to do when something required you to act. The rest I found on your phone." He didn't have anything to say to that. I stayed in the house. You moved into an apartment in Clintonville in November, $1,450 a month. The divorce took 8 months to finalize. Not fast, not clean, but not a war either. We split the equity on the house, which had appreciated enough that my share covered a down payment on a smaller place in the same school district, a 2-bedroom townhouse with a little back patio where I put a table and 2 chairs for the mornings. We worked out a custody arrangement with the help of a mediator. The kids with me 4 days a week, with Brandon 3, alternating holidays. Rachel got me spousal support for 2 years, which I used to pay down the credit card debt that had accumulated in the chaos of the transition. My credit score, which I had been anxious about, ended up fine. Better than fine, actually. By the following spring, I had rebuilt it to 748, which felt like a specific and satisfying kind of small victory. Linda called me once, in December, about 6 weeks after Brandon moved out. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was 4 minutes long. I listened to it once, standing in my kitchen, and it was, and I want to be precise about this, not an apology. It was an explanation. It was a careful, organized accounting of her perspective on the dinner, on our marriage, on me. She said she had always tried to be welcoming. She said Brandon's unhappiness was not something she had caused. She said she hoped I would consider what was best for the children before I made any permanent decisions, as if permanent decisions had not already been made and documented and notarized. I didn't call her back. Patricia texted me in January, just, "Thinking of you and those babies. I hope you're doing okay." I wrote back, "We're okay. Thank you for what you said at the kitchen table. It mattered more than you know." She sent back a single heart emoji, and I saved the exchange. Maya, now 8, knows that Mom and Dad live in different houses, and that this is the way things are. She has processed it with a methodical seriousness that is her particular nature, asking questions when she needs to, and accepting answers when they're honest. Caleb, now 6, has adapted with the cheerful elasticity of a child who has decided that 2 houses means 2 different places where he is loved, and has mostly concerned himself with whether both houses have adequate supplies of the specific goldfish crackers he prefers. They are okay. They are more than okay, on most days. There are hard nights, and there are mornings that feel impossible. And then there are Saturday mornings in the kitchen of my townhouse, making pancakes with both of them on the counter beside me. And those mornings feel like enough. I am 36 years old. I have a mortgage in my name only, a 401k I have been contributing to consistently, 2 children who eat dinner at my table every night I have them, full plates, all the chicken they want. I have Danielle, who came over and helped me paint the living room of the townhouse in February and drank wine with me on the patio afterward until we were laughing about things that had not been funny at the time. I have Patricia's number in my phone, which I have never deleted. And I have this. The memory of the sound my chair made when I pushed it back from Linda's dinner table. That scrape against the hardwood. Loud, deliberate. The kind of sound that cuts through conversation and makes every person in the room go still. I have thought about that sound 1,000 times since October. Not with anger anymore, mostly. With something closer to gratitude. Because that sound was the first true thing I did in a very long time. The first moment I stopped performing compliance and started taking up exactly the space I was entitled to take up. I got up from that table for my kids. But in the months that followed, I understood that I had also, finally, gotten up for myself. Some chairs, once you push them back, you don't sit back down in. And that is not a loss. That is the whole point.